I exposed my mother-in-law's 32-year affair at my own wedding reception because she wore white to steal my spotlight. Let me back up. My name is Kira, and I'm a corporate attorney who spent years building a career on reading people, spotting lies, finding the truth buried in documents that others overlook. That skill became personal the day I married the love of my life and discovered his entire existence was built on a secret his mother had been desperately hiding since before he was born. When I met Leo, I knew he was it for me. 3 years of the kind of love that feels easy and right. But his mother, Lorraine, hated me from day one. I wasn't good enough, wasn't from the right family, wasn't worthy of her precious son. Every family dinner was a minefield. Every holiday, a performance where I had to prove myself while she picked apart everything I did. But I kept my mouth shut. I smiled. I played nice. Until she decided to wear white to my wedding. Not cream, not ivory, not champagne. White. Pure bridal white with pearl details that cost more than my dress probably did. She wanted to humiliate me on the most important day of my life. To show everyone that she'd always matter more to Leo than I ever would. What she didn't know was that I'd been sitting on a secret of my own. One that would tear her perfect life apart at the seams. One that would expose exactly who Lorraine really was behind all that designer clothing and social climbing. This is a long story about family secrets, betrayal, and what happens when someone pushes you too far. I'll need someone to see it through with me. If you want to know how I turned my wedding into Lorraine's worst nightmare, stick around for what comes next. That way you won't miss a single moment of how it all unraveled. The first time I realized something was deeply wrong with Lorraine happened 6 months before the wedding, and it had nothing to do with me. We were having dinner at the Hastings house, one of those mandatory Sunday meals where Lorraine could play perfect matriarch. She'd made this elaborate roast, set the table with china that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and spent the entire evening reminding everyone how blessed they were to be part of her family. Leo's father Thomas was there, of course, and Marcus, Leo's older brother, with his wife Jennifer. Everything seemed normal until Lorraine brought out this manila envelope during dessert. She placed it in front of Leo like it was nothing. Said the family doctor had recommended everyone update their medical records, something about genetic testing becoming more advanced. She wanted Leo to do a DNA test, just routine stuff for the files. I remember thinking it was odd. We were in our late 20s and healthy. Why the sudden urgency? But Leo just shrugged it off, said sure, whatever made his mom happy. That's how he always was with her, always trying to keep the peace. Marcus made a joke about it. Something about how maybe they'd discover he was actually adopted and that's why he never inherited their dad's height. Everyone laughed. Lorraine's laugh sounded forced, brittle. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. 2 weeks later, Leo mentioned he'd done the test, spit in a tube, sent it off to some lab. He said Lorraine told him everything came back normal, nothing to worry about. She'd filed it away with the other medical documents. And that should have been the end of it. Except I'm a lawyer. I'm trained to spot when people are hiding something. And Lorraine had this look on her face for weeks after that test came back. This tight, anxious expression she'd get whenever anyone mentioned family history or genetics or anything remotely related. Thomas didn't seem to notice. Marcus didn't either. But I did. The real crack came about a month later. I was at their house again, this time for Thomas's birthday party. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but I got turned around in their huge house and ended up near Lorraine's private study. The door was slightly open. I should have just walked away. Found the actual bathroom. Minded my own business. But I saw the edge of that manila envelope on her desk. The same one from dinner, and something about the way it was just sitting there, like she'd been looking at it recently, made my stomach turn. I glanced down the hallway. No one was coming. The sounds of the party were distant, muffled. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stepped inside, opened the envelope, and there it was. DNA test results. But not the kind she'd described. This wasn't a simple ancestry or medical screening. This was a paternity analysis, specifically comparing Leo and Marcus. The results showed they were half-siblings, same mother, different fathers. My hands started shaking as I held those papers. I didn't understand what I was looking at, not fully. Why would Lorraine test her own sons against each other? Why would they not share the same father unless one of them wasn't Thomas's biological child? I heard footsteps in the hallway. Quickly. I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of every page, my fingers fumbling with the camera. Then I shoved everything back in the envelope, left the study, and found the actual bathroom where I locked myself in and tried to breathe normally. When I came back to the party, Lorraine was watching me. Just for a second, this sharp, assessing look like she was trying to figure out if I'd seen something I shouldn't have. I smiled at her, complimented the decorations, acted like everything was fine. But nothing was fine. Nothing would ever be fine again. Because I'd just discovered that my future mother-in-law was hiding something massive, something that involved Leo's very identity. And I had no idea how deep this secret went or what it would mean when the truth finally came out. I just knew that Lorraine was terrified of someone finding out. And now I was someone who knew. I didn't sleep that night after Thomas's birthday party. I just kept staring at those photos on my phone, trying to make sense of what I'd found. Half-siblings. Leo and Marcus were half-siblings. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus on contracts and corporate litigation when my entire world was tilting sideways. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started digging. First, I needed to understand what I was looking at. I researched DNA testing, paternity analysis, what those percentages and markers actually meant. The results were clear. Leo and Marcus shared maternal DNA, but their paternal markers were completely different. They had the same mother but different fathers, which meant either Marcus wasn't Thomas's son or Leo wasn't. I thought about the timeline. Marcus was 34, Leo was 32. If Lorraine had cheated, when would it have been? And with who? That's when I made a decision that probably crossed a line. But I was already in too deep to stop now. I hired a private investigator. His name was Derek Mills, recommended by a colleague who'd used him for a messy divorce case. I met him at a coffee shop in a neighborhood where I knew I wouldn't run into anyone from Leo's family. I showed him the photos, explained the situation. He didn't even blink, just nodded like this was the most normal thing in the world. He told me it would take a few weeks, maybe a month. He'd look into Lorraine's history, her social circles around the time Leo would have been conceived, any unusual patterns in her behavior or finances. I went home and tried to act normal, had dinner with Leo, smiled at his stories about work, made love to him that night, while guilt ate away at my insides because I was investigating his mother behind his back. But I kept telling myself I was doing this for him. He deserved to know the truth about who he was. 3 weeks later, Derek called. He told me to come to his office. He said I'd want to be sitting down for this. The manila folder he handed me was thick, so thick. I opened it with trembling fingers, and the first thing I saw was a photograph from 33 years ago. Lorraine, young and beautiful, at some kind of charity gala. She was standing very close to a man who wasn't Thomas. Too close. The way they were looking at each other, even in a faded photograph, made my skin crawl. Derek tapped the photo with his pen. He told me the man's name was Richard Glenwood. He'd been Thomas's business partner back then, co-owner of their commercial real estate firm. Close family friend. Went to all the same parties, all the same events. I flipped through more pages. Bank records that Derek had somehow accessed, showing hotel charges on Lorraine's credit card. Receipts from restaurants in the city when Thomas was supposedly away on business trips. A pattern of Tuesday afternoons at a boutique hotel downtown that lasted for months. The affair had been going on for almost a year before Lorraine got pregnant with Leo. But here's where it got worse. So much worse. Derek had found medical records from when Marcus needed a kidney transplant evaluation 5 years ago. During the screening process, they'd done routine blood typing and genetic testing. That's when discrepancies showed up. Minor red flags in the family medical history that didn't quite match. Lorraine had panicked. She'd requested additional testing, claimed it was just to be thorough for Marcus's sake. But what she'd really been doing was checking if the secret she'd been hiding for decades was about to explode. The DNA test she made Leo take 6 months ago wasn't about updating medical records. It was confirmation of her worst fear. The blood work from Marcus's transplant screening had revealed enough inconsistencies that she needed to know for certain which son wasn't Thomas's, and the test confirmed it. Leo was Richard Glenwood's biological child. I sat in Derek's office reading through page after page of evidence. phone records from 3 decades ago that he'd pulled from archived phone company files, interviews he'd conducted with people who remembered the Hastings and Glenwood families back then, how close they all were, how Richard and Lorraine were always finding excuses to be near each other. One woman, an old friend of Lorraine's who'd had too much wine when Derek interviewed her, admitted she'd always suspected something was going on. She'd seen them together once, at a restaurant across town where they thought no one would recognize them. She'd kept quiet because she didn't want to destroy 2 families. But the absolute worst part, the part that made me want to throw up right there in Derek's office, was what came next. Thomas never knew. Not once in 32 years did he suspect that Leo wasn't his biological son. Lorraine had lied to him every single day. Let him raise another man's child while believing Leo was his own flesh and blood. And when medical science nearly exposed her secret, she'd manipulated the situation to protect herself, not to give Leo the truth he deserved. Derek had even found evidence that Richard Glenwood knew. There were old letters, carefully worded but clear enough if you knew what to look for, where Richard referenced his responsibility and his burden of discretion. He'd known Leo was his son and had stayed silent for 3 decades to protect his own marriage and reputation. I asked Derek if there was any possibility this was wrong, any chance the evidence was mistaken. He looked at me with something like pity in his eyes and told me no. This was airtight. Lorraine Hastings had been living a lie for 32 years, and she'd done whatever it took to keep that lie buried. I drove home in a daze, parked in my driveway and just sat there for 20 minutes staring at nothing. Leo called, asked if I wanted to grab dinner. I could hear the smile in his voice, the easy happiness of someone whose world made sense. I thought about telling him right then, just blurting it all out over the phone. But I didn't. Because I realized something sitting in my car with Derek's folder on the passenger seat. Lorraine had robbed Leo of the truth his entire life. She'd let him build his identity on a foundation of lies. She'd prioritized her own comfort, her own reputation, over his right to know who he really was. And she'd done it all while treating me like dirt, while making me feel small and unworthy and not good enough for her son, the son who wasn't even her husband's. That's when the sadness transformed into something else, something harder and colder. If Lorraine wanted to play games, I had just armed myself with the biggest weapon imaginable, and I was going to wait for exactly the right moment to use it. The hardest part about knowing the truth was pretending I didn't. For the next 2 months, I had to sit across from Lorraine at family dinners and smile, had to listen to her passive-aggressive comments about my career, my clothes, my family background, had to watch her look at Leo with that particular expression that I now understood was equal parts love and guilt. But I'm good at wearing masks. You don't survive corporate law without learning how to hide what you're really thinking. The wedding planning continued. Lorraine inserted herself into every decision, of course. Criticized my choice of flowers, said my venue was too common, implied that my guest list was too heavy on my side of the family and not prestigious enough overall. I let her talk. I nodded. I made small compromises that didn't matter to me but made her feel like she was winning, all while keeping Derek's folder locked in a safe deposit box at my bank. 3 months before the wedding, Lorraine invited me to lunch. Just the 2 of us. I almost said no, but then I realized this might be an opportunity. We met at this upscale bistro she loved, the kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices and everyone knows her by name. She ordered a salad that cost $30 and spent the first 10 minutes talking about some charity board she was on. Then she got to the real reason for lunch. She told me she knew I was a smart woman, that she respected my career, even if she didn't always show it. She said she wanted us to have a better relationship, to start fresh before the wedding. I almost believed her. Almost. But then she leaned forward, put her hand over mine, and told me she just wanted to make sure I understood how important family legacy was to the Hastings. How Thomas had built an empire. How his sons were his pride and joy. How everything he'd worked for was about leaving a foundation for his grandchildren. Her eyes were sharp when she said that last part. She was telling me something without saying it directly. She wanted to make sure I knew my place, that I understood Leo was a Hastings, with all the history and expectation that came with that name. That I was marrying into something bigger than myself. The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. I squeezed her hand back and told her I understood completely, that I knew exactly how important family truth and legacy were, that I would never do anything to disrupt the Hastings Family Foundation. She smiled, relaxed, thought she'd successfully intimidated me into submission. That's when she made her first mistake. She started talking about the wedding, about traditions, about how in her day the mother of the groom had a special role in the ceremony. She mentioned she'd already picked out her dress, something elegant and appropriate. I asked her what color it was. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she told me it was champagne, very subtle, very tasteful. I knew she was lying. I could see it in the way her eyes shifted, the way her fingers tightened around her wine glass. But I just smiled and said that sounded beautiful. 2 weeks later, I was having coffee with Jennifer, Marcus's wife. We'd become friendly over the years, mostly because we were both outsiders who'd married into the Hastings family and understood what that meant. Jennifer mentioned she'd seen Lorraine's dress for the wedding. She seemed uncomfortable bringing it up, like she wasn't sure if she should say anything. I asked her what was wrong. She told me the dress was white, not off-white or cream or any variation, pure white with pearl beading. She'd seen it hanging in Lorraine's closet when she'd stopped by to drop something off. Jennifer asked if I knew about it, if maybe Lorraine had cleared it with me first. I lied and said yes, that Lorraine and I had discussed it and I was fine with it. Jennifer looked relieved, but also confused. She said she couldn't imagine being okay with her mother-in-law wearing white to her wedding, that it seemed deliberately disrespectful. I told her it was fine, that Lorraine just wanted to feel special, that I was secure enough in my relationship with Leo not to feel threatened. But inside, I was calculating. Lorraine was planning to wear white to my wedding. She was going to stand next to her son during photos, during the ceremony, during the reception, and make sure everyone knew she was the most important woman in his life. She was going to humiliate me in front of 200 guests. And she thought I'd just take it. Thought I'd smile and pretend everything was fine because I was too afraid to make a scene. That's when I knew exactly when I'd reveal what I'd found. Not in private. Not in some family meeting where Lorraine could spin the narrative and play the victim. At the wedding. In front of everyone. During my speech. I went home that night and started planning. I had Derek's full report scanned and saved on a secure drive. I had the DNA test results in high resolution. I had photographs, timelines, evidence that would make it impossible for Lorraine to deny what she'd done. Leo asked me why I was smiling so much lately. He said I seemed lighter, happier. He thought maybe I was finally relaxing about the wedding stress. I kissed him and told him I was just excited to marry him, that I couldn't wait to start our life together with complete honesty between us. He had no idea how true that was about to become. 6 weeks before the wedding, Lorraine made her second mistake, the one that sealed everything. We were at Sunday dinner again. Thomas was talking about some property deal he was closing. Marcus was on his phone. Leo was helping himself to seconds. And Lorraine, emboldened by what she thought was her complete control over the situation, leaned over and whispered to me while no one else was paying attention. She told me she hoped I understood that no matter what happened, Leo would always be a Hastings first. That blood mattered. That family legacy was everything. Then she patted my hand, smiled, and told me she was sure I'd make a perfectly adequate addition to the family. That word. Adequate. Like I was a piece of furniture that wasn't quite the right style but would do in a pinch. I looked at her. Really looked at her. At this woman who'd built her entire life on a lie, who'd stolen another woman's husband, passed off the child as her own husband's, and then had the audacity to lecture me about blood and family and legacy. And I smiled back, told her thank you for her confidence, that I hoped I could live up to the Hastings family standards. The look of satisfaction on her face was something I'll never forget. She thought she'd won, thought she'd put me in my place once and for all. She had no idea that she'd just given me the justification I needed to do what I was about to do. Because Lorraine was right about one thing. Family legacy did matter. Truth mattered. Blood mattered. And she was about to find out that you can't build a legacy on lies. Not forever. I had the evidence. I had the moment picked out. But I needed something else to make this work the way I wanted it to. I needed to understand why. Why had Lorraine done it? What made a woman cheat on her husband with his business partner and then spend 3 decades maintaining that lie? Was it just an affair that got out of hand, or was there something deeper? because if I was going to expose her in front of everyone she knew, I wanted to understand the full picture. I didn't want her to be able to explain it away as a mistake, a moment of weakness, something forgivable. I called Derek again, told him I needed to dig deeper into the timeline, into Richard Glenwood's relationship with the family, into what was happening in Lorraine's life 33 years ago. He was hesitant at first. Reminded me that I already had enough evidence to prove the affair and the paternity. Asked me if I really wanted to keep digging, if there was a point where I should just let it go. I told him I needed the whole story, not just for me, for Leo. When this all came out, he'd have questions. He'd want to understand how his mother could do this to his father, to him, to their entire family. Derek sighed and told me he'd see what he could find. It took him 3 weeks. What he uncovered made everything so much worse. Lorraine hadn't just had an affair. She'd been in love with Richard Glenwood. Deeply, desperately, in love. Derek found old letters that Richard had kept, stored in a box in his attic that he apparently couldn't bring himself to throw away even after all these years. Derek had tracked down Richard's older sister, who'd helped him access the family home when Richard was away on business. The letters were devastating. Lorraine had written to Richard about leaving Thomas, about running away together, about how they could start fresh somewhere else. She'd been planning to divorce Thomas and marry Richard instead, but Richard had refused. He was already married, already had a family. His wife came from old money, serious money that made the Hastings fortune look modest. Divorcing her would have meant losing everything: his business connections, his social standing, his children. So he'd broken it off with Lorraine, told her it was over, that they'd had their fun, but it was time to be realistic. That's when Lorraine discovered she was pregnant. According to the timeline Derek constructed from medical records he'd somehow accessed, Lorraine would have found out about the pregnancy right after Richard ended things. She was 8 weeks along when Richard told her he was done with her. She never told him about Leo. The evidence suggested that Lorraine made a calculated decision. She was already married to Thomas, who adored her. They already had Marcus. If she passed this baby off as Thomas's, no one would question it. She could keep her marriage, her status, her comfortable life. And Richard would never know he had another son. But here's the part that made my hands shake when I read Derek's report. Lorraine had been on the verge of telling Thomas the truth several times over the years. Derek found evidence of therapy sessions she'd attended sporadically, session notes from a psychiatrist who'd since retired but had kept records. In those notes, Lorraine had expressed guilt, talked about the burden of the secret, discussed whether she should come clean. The therapist had documented her fear that the truth would destroy her family, that Thomas would leave her, that her sons would hate her. So she'd kept lying, year after year. Watching Leo grow up looking more and more like Richard and less like Thomas, watching Thomas love his son without knowing the boy wasn't biologically his. And then 5 years ago, when Marcus needed that kidney transplant evaluation and the blood work started showing inconsistencies, Lorraine's worst nightmare had nearly come true. Derek had copies of emails between Lorraine and the medical staff. She'd been frantic, trying to control the information, insisting that any unusual results be sent directly to her first before anyone else saw them. She'd managed to keep it contained. Barely. But that's when she started planning. She'd ordered the DNA test kit months before she actually gave it to Leo, had been building up the courage to confirm what she already suspected. When the results came back showing Leo and Marcus were half-siblings, she'd locked herself in her study and apparently cried for hours. Jennifer had mentioned that day to me once. Said Lorraine had claimed she was overwhelmed with emotion about some charity project. Now I knew the real reason. But even then, even with confirmation that her secret was real and documented, Lorraine hadn't told anyone. She'd hidden the results, lied to Leo about what the test showed, and went right back to living her perfectly curated life. The therapy notes from years ago mentioned something else too, something that made everything click into place. Lorraine's therapist had written that her patient displayed narcissistic tendencies, an overwhelming need to maintain her public image, an inability to accept responsibility for her actions. The therapist had noted that Lorraine seemed more concerned with how the revelation would affect her reputation than how it would affect her family. That's who Lorraine really was. Someone so obsessed with appearances, with status, with being seen as the perfect wife and mother, that she'd rather let her son live a lie than risk her own image being tarnished. And suddenly her treatment of me made perfect sense. I was a threat to her carefully constructed world. I was someone smart enough to potentially uncover her secrets, someone who asked questions, someone who didn't just accept her authority without question. She'd been trying to push me away from Leo for years, not because I wasn't good enough for him, but because she was terrified of what I might discover. I sat in my apartment reading through Derek's final report, and I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This wasn't just about embarrassing Lorraine for wearing white to my wedding. This was about Leo's right to know who he was, about Thomas's right to know he'd been betrayed, about Marcus's right to understand why his relationship with his brother had always felt slightly off. This was about truth. Real, painful, necessary truth. Derek had included one more thing in his folder, a current photo of Richard Glenwood, taken within the last month. He was on the guest list for our wedding. Lorraine had invited Leo's biological father to watch him get married, and Richard had accepted. He was going to sit in that church, watch the son he'd abandoned without even knowing it walk down the aisle and pretend everything was normal. The audacity of it made me want to scream. But instead, I started planning the final details. I contacted the AV company handling our reception, told them I'd be sending them a presentation to load into their system, something I wanted to display during my speech as a surprise for Leo. I prepared the slides, photos of the DNA results, copies of the relevant documents, a clear, simple timeline that any guest would be able to understand in seconds. I practiced my speech in the mirror, timing it perfectly, calm, collected, devastating, and I waited. Lorraine called me 2 weeks before the wedding. She wanted to discuss the seating arrangements, had some opinions about where certain people should be placed. I listened patiently while she rearranged my carefully planned layout to suit her preferences. Then she mentioned, almost casually, that Richard Glenwood should probably sit with the family in one of the front sections since he and Thomas went back so far. The nerve of her. Putting her former lover right there with the family. Making Thomas sit near the man who'd betrayed him without Thomas even knowing it. I told her that sounded fine, that I trusted her judgment on family placement. She was pleased, told me I was finally learning how to be a proper Hastings wife. I smiled into the phone and thought about how that smile would look on her face in 2 weeks, when her entire world collapsed in front of 200 witnesses. The final piece fell into place 3 days before the wedding. I went to see Thomas. He was at his office, working late as usual. I told his assistant I needed to discuss a last-minute wedding detail, something about the father-son dance that I wanted to make sure was perfect. Thomas welcomed me into his office with that warm, genuine smile he always had. He'd been nothing but kind to me from the day Leo introduced us. He'd told me he was thrilled Leo had found someone smart and ambitious, someone who challenged him. We talked about the wedding for a few minutes. He was excited, emotional about his youngest son getting married. Then I asked him a question that seemed random but wasn't. I asked him if he ever worried about family secrets, about things that might be hidden that could hurt the people you love. He looked at me strangely. Said he supposed everyone had family secrets, but that honesty was always better in the long run. That lies had a way of growing until they poisoned everything. I told him I agreed. That I thought truth, even painful truth, was a gift. He said I was wise beyond my years. I left his office knowing that what I was about to do would destroy him, that the man who'd been nothing but good to me would have his heart broken in the most public way possible. But he deserved to know. He'd lived 32 years believing a lie, and every additional day of that lie was another day stolen from him. 3 days later, I stood in my childhood bedroom in my wedding dress, looking at myself in the mirror. My maid of honor asked me if I was nervous. I told her I'd never been more certain of anything in my life, and I meant it. The morning of the wedding, I woke up with absolute clarity. Everything was ready. The evidence was loaded into the presentation system. My speech was memorized. The pieces were all in position. I went through the motions of getting ready like any other bride. Hair, makeup, the dress. My bridesmaids chattering around me, excited and happy. My mom crying the way mothers do at their daughter's wedding. Nobody knew what was coming. Leo texted me that morning, told me he couldn't wait to see me, that he was the luckiest man alive, that he loved me more than he could put into words. I stared at that text for a long time. Part of me wanted to call it off, to pull him aside before the ceremony and tell him everything privately, give him a chance to process before the world found out. But then I thought about Lorraine, about how she'd had 32 years to tell him privately, how she'd chosen her comfort over his truth every single time, how she'd looked me in the eye 2 days ago and reminded me that I needed to make sure my shoes weren't too high because she didn't want me towering over Leo in the photos. The audacity. The absolute audacity of this woman to be dictating photo aesthetics while hiding something this massive. I texted Leo back, told him I loved him too, that today was going to be a day neither of us would ever forget. The ceremony was at 3. I arrived at the venue at noon for photos. The place looked beautiful, exactly what I'd envisioned. White roses everywhere, soft lighting, elegant but not ostentatious. Lorraine was already there, of course, directing the staff, repositioning centerpieces, acting like this was her event. And she was wearing the dress. White. Absolutely. Undeniably white. Not a hint of cream or ivory or any other color. Pure bridal white with pearl beading across the bodice. It probably cost $5,000. It was stunning. It was also completely inappropriate. My bridesmaids saw it and went silent. One of them asked me quietly if I wanted her to say something to Lorraine. I told her no, that it was fine, that Lorraine could wear whatever she wanted. They looked at me like I was crazy. Jennifer, Marcus's wife, pulled me aside. She apologized, said she'd tried to convince Lorraine to change, but Lorraine had insisted the dress was champagne and that everyone was being too sensitive. I hugged Jennifer and told her not to worry about it, that everything was going to work out exactly as it should. She looked relieved but confused. The ceremony started at 3. I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, and Leo's face when he saw me made my heart hurt. He looked at me like I was everything he'd ever wanted. Thomas was crying. Marcus looked happy. And Lorraine stood there in her white dress, smiling like she'd won some kind of victory. The ceremony was beautiful, traditional, heartfelt, exactly what we'd planned. Leo and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. He promised to always be honest with me, to build a life based on trust and love. I promised him the same. I meant every word. When the officiant pronounced us married and Leo kissed me, the guests erupted in applause. We walked back down the aisle together, and I saw Lorraine in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, in a white dress, at her son's wedding, playing the devoted mother while hiding the biggest lie imaginable. The reception started at 5. Cocktail hour first, then dinner, then speeches. I'd specifically requested that the speeches happen after dinner, when everyone was relaxed, when wine had been flowing for a while, when people's guards were down. I made small talk, smiled for photos. Lorraine positioned herself in every family shot, making sure she was always close to Leo. The photographer kept having to work around her dress, trying to angle things so it didn't look like there were 2 brides in the photos. Dinner was perfect. The food was excellent. People were happy, laughing, celebrating. Thomas gave the first speech. He talked about watching Leo grow up, about how proud he was of the man his son had become, about how he'd known from the moment he met me that I was the right woman for Leo. He choked up talking about family, about how lucky he was to have his sons, how grateful he was for the life he and Lorraine had built together. I watched Lorraine while he spoke. She was crying, but something about it felt performative, like she was playing the role of the emotional mother rather than actually feeling it. My father spoke next. Short and sweet, welcoming Leo to our family, making a joke about how Leo better take good care of me or he'd have to answer to my 3 brothers. Everyone laughed. The mood was light, joyful. Then the DJ announced it was time for the bride's speech. I stood up, took the microphone, looked out at 200 faces all turned toward me. Leo was smiling, expecting me to say something sweet and romantic. Thomas looked proud. Marcus was recording on his phone, and Lorraine sat there in her white dress, probably thinking she'd successfully overshadowed me, that she'd made sure everyone knew who the real important woman in Leo's life was. I saw Richard Glenwood 3 tables back. He was drinking champagne, completely relaxed, laughing at something the person next to him had said. The man who'd fathered Leo and walked away, who'd kept that secret for 3 decades, who'd accepted an invitation to his biological son's wedding without ever planning to acknowledge the truth. I started my speech the traditional way. Thanked everyone for coming, talked about how much it meant to have our loved ones celebrating with us. Then I thanked my parents, talked about how they'd raised me to value honesty and integrity above everything else. I saw Lorraine shift in her seat. Something in my tone must have registered. I thanked Thomas for welcoming me into the family, for being an example of what real fatherhood looks like, showing up, supporting, loving unconditionally even when it's not easy. His eyes were wet. He mouthed, "Thank you." Then I turned to look directly at Lorraine, and I began. I thanked her for wearing white. Really drew out that moment, let it hang in the air. Let everyone in the room register what I'd just said and look at her dress. The room got very quiet, very fast. I kept my voice calm, steady. Said I wanted to thank her for something else too, something that she probably thought nobody knew about. Lorraine's face went pale. She looked like she was trying to figure out how to interrupt me, how to shut this down, but there was no way to do it without causing a scene. And I had the microphone. I thanked her for the DNA test she'd done 6 months ago. The one she'd told Leo was just routine but was actually to confirm something she'd been terrified of for years. Leo's smile disappeared. He looked confused, glancing between me and his mother. I told the room that the test had shown something fascinating, that Leo and Marcus weren't full brothers like everyone had always believed. Marcus stopped recording. His wife grabbed his arm. Thomas sat up straight, his face shifting from confusion to something else, something harder. And then I said it. I told them all that Leo wasn't Thomas's biological son, that he was actually the child of Richard Glenwood, Thomas's former business partner, the result of an affair that happened 33 years ago. The room exploded into noise, but I wasn't finished. I gestured to the screen behind me, and the presentation began. DNA results displayed in clear, undeniable detail, documents, timelines. Everything laid out so perfectly that there was no room for doubt. I kept talking through the chaos, kept my voice level and factual, explained how Lorraine had been having an affair with Richard while married to Thomas, how she'd gotten pregnant and passed Leo off as her husband's son, how she'd lied for 32 years, how she'd only done the DNA test because she was afraid medical records would expose her. Thomas stood up. His chair fell backward. Lorraine was crying, trying to speak, but no sound was coming out. Richard Glenwood was trying to leave, but people were blocking the exits now, everyone trying to see what was happening. Marcus looked like he'd been punched, and Leo, my beautiful Leo. He was staring at me with absolute shock, trying to understand why I'd just blown up his entire life in front of everyone he knew. I kept going, told them how Lorraine had hidden the test results from everyone, how Richard had known Leo was his son and stayed silent, how the two of them had prioritized their own comfort over the truth for 3 decades. I looked at Lorraine in her white dress and told the room that she'd wanted to be the center of attention at this wedding, that she'd worn white to make sure everyone remembered who she was. And now they would. They'd remember this day forever. The rest of the speech was a blur. I finished by saying I loved Leo more than anything, that he deserved to know the truth about where he came from, and that truth was the only foundation worth building a marriage on. Then I put down the microphone and walked over to Leo. He was crying. Silent tears running down his face while people shouted and moved around us. I took his hands and looked into his eyes. I told him I was sorry it happened this way, that I'd wanted to tell him privately, but his mother's behavior made me realize she'd never voluntarily give him the truth, that he deserved better than living a lie. He pulled his hands away and walked out of the reception. The reception hall descended into absolute chaos. Thomas was shouting at Lorraine, demanding to know if it was true. She was sobbing, trying to grab his arm, but he kept pulling away from her like her touch burned him. Marcus had his phone out, staring at the DNA results still displayed on the screen behind me. His wife was trying to calm him down, but he looked completely shattered. Richard Glenwood was being confronted by his own wife, who'd been sitting 2 tables away with absolutely no idea she'd just discovered her husband had a secret child. She was screaming at him in front of everyone, her face twisted with rage and betrayal. And I stood there in my wedding dress, watching it all unfold, feeling strangely calm. My maid of honor grabbed my arm and asked me what I wanted to do. if I wanted to go after Leo. I told her yes, that I needed to find my husband. The word felt strange. Husband. We'd been married for less than 3 hours, and I'd already destroyed his family. I found him outside the venue, sitting on a bench in the garden area. His head was in his hands, his shoulders were shaking. I sat down next to him, didn't touch him, just sat there. He finally looked up at me. His eyes were red, his face blotchy from crying. He asked me how long I'd known. I told him the truth. 3 months. Since I'd accidentally found the DNA results in his mother's study. He asked why I didn't tell him right away. I explained everything. How I'd wanted to be sure first. How I'd hired an investigator to verify what I'd found. How I'd discovered not just the affair, but the entire scope of the lie his mother had been living. How I'd planned to tell him after the wedding, privately, but then his mother had pushed too far with the white dress and the constant disrespect. He stood up, paced away from me, asked if I'd really just destroyed his entire family in front of 200 people because I was mad about a dress. The accusation stung, but I understood it. He was processing, lashing out, trying to make sense of something that made no sense. I told him it wasn't about the dress. It was about the fact that his mother had been given 32 years to tell him the truth, and she never did. That she would have taken this secret to her grave if she could have. That she cared more about her reputation than his right to know who he really was. He asked me who I thought I was to make that decision for him, to decide when and how he learned something this devastating about his own life. I didn't have a good answer for that, because he was right. I'd taken away his choice just as much as Lorraine had. We stood there in that garden while the chaos continued inside. I could hear shouting through the walls, the sound of our wedding reception tearing itself apart. Leo finally turned to look at me. He told me he needed time. That he couldn't be around me right now. That everything he thought he knew about himself, about his family, about his life had just been revealed as a lie, and he didn't know how to process any of it. I told him I understood. That I'd give him whatever space he needed. He started walking toward the parking lot, then stopped and turned back. He said he loved me. That he'd meant every word of his vows. But he didn't know if he could forgive me for doing it this way. For making something this private into a public spectacle. I watched him get into his car and drive away from our own wedding reception. Then I went back inside. The scene that greeted me was worse than I'd imagined. Thomas was confronting Richard by the bar. Security was trying to keep them separated, but Thomas kept pushing forward, demanding answers. He wanted to know how long the affair had lasted, if Richard had known about Leo, why he'd stayed silent all these years. Richard was trying to leave, but his wife was blocking his path, screaming that she wanted answers too. That she'd wasted 35 years on a man who was a liar and a coward. Lorraine had collapsed into a chair at her table. Several of her society friends were surrounding her, but I could see the judgment on their faces. This was the kind of scandal that would ruin her social standing permanently. Marcus was standing in the middle of the dance floor looking lost. Jennifer was with him, but he seemed to be in shock, just staring at nothing. My parents found me. My dad looked horrified. He asked me what I'd just done, if I'd really planned this whole thing. I told him yes, that I'd made a choice and I'd live with the consequences. My mom was crying. She said she'd raised me better than this. That public humiliation wasn't justice, it was cruelty. Maybe she was right. The venue manager approached me and asked if I wanted them to end the reception early. Most of the guests were leaving anyway, unable to stomach the family drama playing out in front of them. I told him yes, to shut it down. I went back to the bridal suite and changed out of my wedding dress, put on jeans and a sweater, felt more like myself. When I came back out, the reception hall was nearly empty. The staff was cleaning up. The beautiful decorations seemed obscene now. Wedding flowers at the scene of a massacre. Thomas found me near the entrance. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. His face was gray, his eyes hollow. He asked me if I had proof of everything I'd said. Real, documented proof. I told him I did. That I had copies of everything if he wanted to see it. He said yes. That he needed to know the full truth. That after 32 years of being lied to, He deserved to understand exactly what had been done to him. I gave him the address of my apartment, told him I'd show him everything tomorrow that he should take tonight to process. He thanked me. His voice was broken, but there was something else there too. Relief, maybe. Or validation. Like some part of him had suspected something was wrong all these years and now finally had confirmation. Before he left, he said something that I'll never forget. He told me that what I'd done was brutal, but that lies that big don't deserve gentle reveals. That Lorraine had made her choices 3 decades ago, and now she had to face them. That I'd given him something she never would have. The truth. I watched him walk out to his car, his shoulders bent like he was carrying a physical weight. Marcus left without speaking to me, wouldn't even make eye contact. Richard and his wife had already gone, her dragging him by the arm toward their car while she continued to berate him. And Lorraine sat alone in that reception hall in her white dress, mascara running down her face, the ruins of her carefully constructed life scattered around her. She looked at me with pure hatred. She said I'd destroyed everything, that I was vindictive and cruel, and that she'd been right about me from the beginning. I told her she'd destroyed everything 33 years ago. I'd just turned on the lights. Then I left. I went home to my empty apartment, my wedding night, alone. My phone was blowing up. Text messages from friends and family, everyone asking what had happened, if I was okay, what I was thinking. I turned it off, sat on my couch in the dark, and wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. The next morning, I woke up on my couch still wearing yesterday's clothes. For a moment, I thought maybe it had been a dream, a horrible, vivid nightmare. Then I saw my wedding dress hanging on the back of my bedroom door and knew it was all real. I'd exposed my mother-in-law's 32-year secret in front of 200 people. I'd destroyed multiple families in one speech. And my husband had left our wedding reception and hadn't called me since. My phone had 47 missed calls and over 100 text messages. Most of them were from people I barely knew, asking for details, wanting to know if the whole thing was real. Vultures circling the wreckage. But there was one from Leo, sent at 3 a.m. It just said he needed time, that he was staying at Marcus's place, that we'd talk when he was ready. There was also a message from Thomas. He was coming over at noon to see the evidence I'd promised him. I spent the morning organizing everything. Made copies of Derek's full report, the DNA results, all the documentation. Laid it out chronologically so it would be easy to understand. Thomas arrived exactly at noon. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept at all. I made coffee, we sat at my kitchen table, and I showed him everything. He read through it all in silence, every page, every document, every piece of evidence that proved his wife had been lying to him for their entire marriage. When he got to the letters between Lorraine and Richard, the ones where she'd talked about leaving him, his hands started shaking. He asked me where I'd found all of this, how I'd gotten access to things from decades ago. I told him about hiring Derek, about the investigation, about how thorough I'd needed to be before I could be certain. He was quiet for a long time after he finished reading. Then he said something I didn't expect. He thanked me. He said he'd spent 32 years being made to feel crazy. That there'd been moments over the years where he'd wondered about Leo's paternity, wondered why Leo looked nothing like him, wondered about the way Lorraine sometimes acted around Richard. But every time he'd questioned anything, Lorraine had made him feel paranoid and insecure, had convinced him he was imagining things. Now he knew he'd been right all along. He asked me if I thought he was a fool for not seeing it sooner. I told him no, that Lorraine was an expert manipulator, that she'd spent 3 decades perfecting her lies, that anyone would have believed her. He started crying. This successful, powerful businessman just broke down at my kitchen table. He said the worst part wasn't even the affair. It was that she'd let him love Leo as his son, let him build his entire identity as Leo's father, and then taken that away. I reminded him that he was Leo's father in every way that mattered, that biology didn't erase 32 years of love and parenting. He said he knew that intellectually, but right now it felt like his entire life had been stolen from him. I understood. Because in exposing Lorraine's lie, I'd stolen something from him too. I'd taken away his ability to live in ignorance, to continue believing his marriage was real. Before he left, he told me he was filing for divorce, that there was no coming back from this, that he couldn't look at Lorraine without seeing 3 decades of deception. He also said he wanted to maintain his relationship with Leo, that he planned to tell Leo that nothing had changed between them, that he was still his father and always would be. I told him I thought that was exactly what Leo needed to hear. After Thomas left, I sat in my apartment and waited. Leo finally called 3 days later. His voice sounded hollow, exhausted. He said he'd been talking to a therapist, trying to process everything. He asked if we could meet, somewhere neutral, not his place or mine. We met at a coffee shop across town. He looked like he'd lost weight, like he hadn't been eating or sleeping properly. We sat across from each other, and for the first time since I'd known him, it felt like there was a wall between us. He told me he understood why I'd done it, that he'd spent the last 3 days thinking about nothing else, and he understood that his mother would never have told him the truth on her own. But the way I'd done it, in front of everyone, humiliating his entire family, he didn't know if he could forgive that. I told him I was sorry, that if I could go back and do it differently, I would. That I'd been so focused on making Lorraine face consequences that I hadn't fully considered how it would affect everyone else. He asked me if I'd planned it as revenge for the white dress. I told him no. That I'd planned to reveal the truth after the wedding, privately. But the dress had been the final straw that made me realize Lorraine would never stop trying to control and manipulate us. That she needed to face public consequences for a public deception. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something that broke my heart. He said he loved me, that he'd meant his vows. But he didn't know if he could build a marriage with someone who'd kept something this huge from him for 3 months. Someone who'd made a decision this massive without including him. I understood. Because he was right. I'd done to him exactly what Lorraine had done, decided what truth he could handle and when. We sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours. Talked about everything. About trust and honesty and whether our marriage could survive this. By the end, we hadn't reached any conclusions, just agreed to keep talking, to give it time. That was a year ago. I'm writing this now because someone asked me yesterday if I regretted what I did, if I would do it differently. The honest answer is complicated. I don't regret exposing the truth. Leo deserved to know who he really was. Thomas deserved to know his marriage was built on a lie. Even Marcus deserved to understand the family dynamics that had shaped his childhood. But I do regret the way I did it. The public spectacle, the humiliation, the cruelty of making them all learn something this devastating in front of everyone they knew. If I could go back, I'd tell Leo privately. I'd give him the choice of how to handle it. I'd trust that he was strong enough to confront his mother on his own terms. But I can't go back. I can only live with what I did. So here's where we are now. Thomas did divorce Lorraine. It was fast and brutal. She tried to fight for alimony, claiming she'd been a devoted wife for 35 years. The judge wasn't sympathetic. She got far less than she would have if the circumstances had been different. She's living alone now in a smaller house, cut off from most of her social circle. The scandal was too big, too juicy. She went from society darling to social pariah overnight. Marcus eventually started speaking to Leo again. It took months, but they rebuilt their relationship. Jennifer helped facilitate it, pushed Marcus to recognize that none of this was Leo's fault. Thomas kept his promise. He told Leo that biology didn't matter, that he was still his son in every way that counted. They have dinner once a week. Thomas walked away from his business partnership with Richard, but kept everything else. Richard's wife divorced him too. He lost most of his assets in the settlement. Last I heard, he tried to reach out to Leo, wanted to establish some kind of relationship. Leo blocked his number. And Leo and me, we're still married. Barely. We're in couples therapy, trying to rebuild trust. Some days are better than others. He told me last month that he's forgiven me for exposing the secret. That part he understands now, sees as necessary even. But forgiving me for keeping it from him for 3 months, for making that choice without him, that's harder. That feels like a betrayal that cuts deeper because it came from me, the person who's supposed to be his partner. We're working on it. Taking it one day at a time. I learned something through all of this. Something I wish I'd known before I'd stood up at that reception with a microphone and a presentation ready to destroy lives. The truth is important, necessary even. But the way you deliver truth matters just as much as the truth itself. You can be right and still be cruel. You can be justified and still cause unnecessary harm. I was right about everything I said that night. Lorraine had lied, had deceived, had prioritized herself over everyone else for 3 decades. But I didn't have to be cruel about exposing it. I think about Lorraine sometimes. Wonder if she's learned anything from losing everything. Wonder if she feels remorse or just anger at being caught. I don't know. We don't speak. Leo made that a condition of us working on our marriage, that I stay away from his mother. I agreed. Gladly. Last week, Leo and I celebrated our first anniversary. We didn't make a big deal out of it. Just dinner at home, quiet and intimate. He told me he was glad we were still together, that the truth I'd forced into the light, as painful as it was, had freed him from a lifetime of feeling like something was wrong, but never knowing what. He said he was learning to see Thomas not as the man who unknowingly raised another man's child, but as the father who chose him every single day for 32 years. That the choice to love matters more than the accident of biology. I asked him if he'd ever forgive me completely. He said he didn't know. That some scars don't fully heal, they just become part of you. I can live with that. Because here's what I know now. Revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but it's a bitter prize. The high of exposing Lorraine, of watching her perfect facade crumble, lasted maybe an hour. The consequences have lasted a lifetime. Would I do it again? I honestly don't know. But I do know this. If you're thinking about exposing someone's secrets, about burning their life down because they hurt you, take a minute first. Ask yourself if the satisfaction is worth the cost. Not just to them, but to everyone around them. To yourself. Because the truth will set you free. But first, it might destroy everything you thought you were building. And sometimes, just sometimes, the destruction isn't worth it. I'm telling this story because I see people online every day talking about revenge, about exposing liars, about justice and karma. They make it sound empowering, righteous. Maybe sometimes it is. But it's also messy and complicated and painful in ways you can't predict. So if you're sitting on a secret right now, if you're planning your own moment of revelation, just think it through. Consider who else gets caught in the blast radius. Consider whether there's a way to tell the truth without causing unnecessary pain. I didn't do that. I was so focused on making Lorraine hurt the way she'd made me feel small and inadequate that I forgot to consider Leo's pain, Thomas's pain, Marcus's pain. That's my real regret, not the truth, the casualty count. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever exposed a family secret? How did it turn out? I'd love to know I'm not alone in this complicated space between right and wrong. Drop a comment and let me know what city you're watching from. It helps me feel less isolated in all of this. And if you want to follow along with more stories like this, stories about the messy reality of family drama and difficult choices, you can subscribe. That way you'll know when the next chapter of someone's complicated life gets shared, because we're all just trying to figure this out as we go. And sometimes the only thing that helps is knowing someone else has walked through the fire too.